Margaret Thatcher, Britain's 49th Prime Minister.
I think it was really that it was my father who shaped my character. The system which I believe in finds its most eloquent expression in the American Declaration of Independence. Each of us does the job according to the needs of the time and as we see the needs of the time, because in my case you just had to have a star to steer by.
Now, a conversation with Margaret Thatcher, hosted by Lee Cullum.
Mrs. Thatcher, of course, you're famous for being a grocer's daughter who made her way all the way to the pinnacle of British government and to the pinnacle of world leadership, really. And you grew up in the Methodist Church, two things that interest me a great deal. And I wonder what it was about those experiences, shopkeeping and Methodism, that shaped your character. What would you say?
I think it was really that it was my father who shaped my character. He was a Methodist and he was a shopkeeper. But nevertheless, both those things did have a great effect. First, if you are brought up over a grocer's shop, you're used to going down frequently to calls which come in at any time of the day and perhaps after hours. So your work doesn't stop. Secondly, you're used to talking to people. And so I learned to be in there. I learned to be with people. I learned to listen to what I thought was really rather exciting things about what was happening. The same thing happens, I think, when you're a very active member of a church. You learn always to be with people. You learn to give out. If you've got to get anything back, you have to give out first. One other thing underlined every single thing we did. You were taught the value of work. You were taught to work. You were taught it was wrong to be idle. You were taught that cleanliness was next to godliness. And you were taught that if you found something was wrong in the life of the town, it wasn't enough to get up and make a speech about it. You had to go out and do something about it yourself. So all of this was very much the family ethic and the work ethic. And my father never wasted a moment. He and my mother ran the shop, and then he also was on our local council. He was chairman of our local finance committee. He was a doer, he was a giver. And having that background means that you absorb it right into your bloodstream right from childhood.
How much of your career did your father live to see?
Quite a lot. He lived to see me Minister of Education, a member of the Cabinet, which was very exciting. We were thrilled. He was thrilled, obviously, when I became a Member of Parliament. And I learned really to debate from him. He was a very, very good speaker. He was the best self-educated man that I knew, and naturally had a passion for my sister and I to do as well as we could. Don't you find in life that you try to give your children the things which you didn't have yourself? So my father didn't have the benefit of education, so anything that could be remotely thought of as educational was good for me.
You did get to Oxford, your father saw to that, and you studied chemistry. What led you to that choice?
I think I had a very, very good teacher in chemistry who really inspired one's imagination, taught chemistry, taught the wonders of science, and they are wonders, and they were unfolding so fast in those days. So a whole new world was developing, and it was quite clear that science was going to be the thing. The plastics, the dyes, the new materials, the new radio, the new communications. So it was a very good thing if you wanted to be sure of a job to go on the scientific side, and added to that a fascinating teacher who taught marvelously. I think children's interests are often engaged by their teacher. Certainly it was so in my case.
Yes, of course. Well, you did get a job. You aimed for a job. You got a job in an ice cream company, as I recall, as a chemist.
Oh, that was much later, in a food company.
All right. What did you do for them?
I got a job first in plastics when we were developing things, and then also in a food company. Ice cream was one of its products. What we did was two things. We did a certain amount of process control. And also, we did in that laboratory, it was one of the companies, a big company, which believed it was its duty to engage on some basic fundamental research. And we, in those days, did some work on the chemistry of surfaces.
Of course, at that time you were studying chemistry, you were looking ahead to law, but you were also deeply involved in conservative politics while you were at Oxford.
Yes.
And I have wondered what drew you to the Tory party. I don't believe your father was a Tory, was he?
I think he was much more liberal, but that's very much closer to being conservative than socialist. He was very independent, and he didn't believe being dependent on the state in any way. So we were brought up with this feeling that first, you know, it's your bounden duty to take responsibility for your own life. You work for yourself and for your family, and you save, and then you look after the unfortunate. So it is our bounden duty to be independent of the state if we possibly could be. If we were really unfortunate, then and only then did we rely on the state, but it was independence. And so naturally, the whole structure of a free society, the freedom, the rule of law, the free enterprise society, the generosity to others out of your own efforts was very much more in keeping with the Conservative Party.
And then you ran for Parliament and you were elected at age 32. You had already run in Ross twice.
I ran for Parliament when I was 23.
You're amazing.
As a candidate, I learned a lot from it. I worked in a tough Labour area, and I have just loved it. I just loved it. It wasn't that I went into it, it was that I couldn't get away from it. You know, it was a total fascination.
Yes,
and still
it was
is.
always your passion,
Yes,
I can tell.
yes. Yes.
Well, your first big job was in education, Secretary of State
Big
for
job,
Education,
yes.
as you mentioned. And of course, British schools have been in trouble for a long time. I think I read that as long ago as 1860, British education really did have problems. What did you try to do at that time to correct the situation?
We were trying at that time to look at the content of the curriculum rather more than the structure of schools. The previous Secretaries of State for Education had said, oh, we must do away with grammar schools. Now, grammar schools were where you had a test. You had a test at about the age of 11. And if you had great academic ability, you went to a particular type of school, which was a grammar school where you expected to go on to university. And that catered for about 20% of the population. And then there were other more practical schools, which catered for people who liked to have a more practical bent. Now, there are people in education who thought that was completely wrong and you should all go to the same school. One of the problems was that meant you went into very much bigger schools. It also meant that perhaps the young people who were of a more practical and less academic bent didn't get so many leadership positions in the schools as they would otherwise have had. But it was this restructuring, everyone goes the same, and the next thing in those days, they had some awfully strange, fashionable ideas in education, was that you mustn't stream by ability. You mustn't test by exams or tests because some people would fail. It was a very bad period. And I was trying to say, look, in life you do have to go through tests. In life you do have to qualify. You can earn just as much, sometimes even more, if you have a practical bent, if you go in business. And I felt that we should keep some of these specialties. And so now, for the first time in our history, we have a compulsory curriculum. It started really when I was there, but we shied away from making it compulsory. We don't now. We think our duty to the children is so great that after 11 years minimum compulsory education, they ought to come out both equipped for the world of work and having a pretty good general knowledge and not being allowed to drop, say, a scientific subject before they were 16. It's fascinating education.
Yes. Turning to higher education for a moment, I read several years ago in the Sunday Times that a classical education, for which Oxford and Cambridge are so famous, is fine for running an empire, but not so good for running an economy. Do you think there's any truth in that?
No, I don't. If you excel at a classical education, Latin and Greek, not only at the language but at learning the literature, you will have learned a great deal about the philosophy of life, about democracy, about fundamental principles, and you will have a very good mind. I really learned English grammar when I had to learn Latin. And it opened up a new world. It really does. You don't think they're dead languages. The fundamental principles that go through life are relevant to all times. You learn them if you read Latin. You learn Caesar, you learn Virgil, you learn between Latin and Greek. You will learn all of the philosophers. You will learn Pericles, you will learn Socrates, Thucydides. You start to learn all of these classic things. You will know the fundamentals of how people think, what the problems are, how they approach international affairs, their old battles, their old enmities. And heaven knows these days we're still up against human nature rather more than anything else.
Yes, that's true. I have heard that there was a book written years ago that you admired very much called A Time for Greatness.
Herbert
by Agar. Yes.
Herbert Agar, very much. Absolutely right. Beautifully written. The web of life is woven without void. Yes, I can remember so much from it. Mm-hmm.
And you quote poetry. I noticed you were about to quote this, but I understand you quote poetry a great deal. Who is your favorite poet?
Oh, it's difficult to have a favorite poet, isn't it? There are so many of them. Doesn't matter whether it's Milton or Tennyson or Rupert Brooke or W.H. Auden in the more modern poets. Wordsworth, Gray's Elegy, some of the great poets. Yeats, Shelley, all of them. All of them. But the economy of language, the thought that they can express in so few words. You know, the end of Tennyson, "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and strike the sounding furrows, for though we are not now that which we were in old times, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will." And then it's marvelous, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Oh, young people miss a tremendous lot if they don't learn by heart some of the poetry and some of the prose. That will stay with you. It's worth learning it as a child. If you live a long time, you may remember it for 70 or 80 or 90 years.
Yes. When you became party leader in 1975, you decided that the Conservatives had to have an ideology. You said the other side has an ideology against which it can measure its policies, but we don't have one. We've got to have one too. And out of it came Thatcherism. But what was the ideology behind Thatcherism, would you say?
There are basically two ways of running any country, any political system. The one is socialist communism, all power to the state. The state does the planning and the people have to conform to the plan. The people are the pawns of the state. They have no human rights other than those granted to them by the state. Now, to me, with my religious background, that was totally and utterly wrong. It denied the human spirit. The system which I believe in finds its most eloquent expression in the American Declaration of Independence. That the state is there to serve the liberties of the people, their own spirit, to develop their own talents and abilities, and so that the strong does not intimidate the weak. Freedom is made to work by a rule of law. So it is freedom of the individual, a rule of law, and the government is there to serve these qualities. So it's your duty to use your talents and abilities. It's your duty to accept responsibilities because you accept freedom. You need private property for that. The property doesn't belong to the state. The land, you have your own land, your own shares, you have savings, you have thrift. You develop your own talents. And out of that, it is your bounden duty to give to those less fortunate than yourselves. The one, the state is all, the people conform. The other, The state is there to serve the liberties, the dynamism, the enterprise, the talent, the ability of the people with the rule of law. So it's freedom and justice.
Of course, the economy was your great triumph in Britain, it seems to me. You had many triumphs, but this was the great triumph. And I think back to Britain of the 18th and 19th centuries with the great entrepreneurs who gave us the Industrial Revolution. These were very enterprising people. But for some reason, they failed to reinvest in their companies. Leadership in steel was lost to Germany and the United States at the end of the 19th century. On the eve of World War II, Britain was virtually bankrupt. What went wrong? They built great country houses, but now they're holed up in 2 or 3 rooms, these great families, and the public is trekking through.
You ask what went wrong. It's difficult to analyze, isn't it? We were first into the Industrial Revolution and got the whole thing going.
Oh, yes.
Many scientific things going. Some of the early cars too were going. We kept some of our genius. A particular example in aircraft. If we hadn't had our genius in aircraft and got the Spitfire in time, we shouldn't have won the Battle of Britain. If we hadn't had our genius in some of the scientific and got radar, we should not, in fact, again, have been able to win against the incoming planes. Interesting then, as in the recent Gulf War, the advanced technology helped us to win. But what happened? It was strange in Britain. So often the first generation had the dynamism, the enterprise, and built these things. They wanted to create things. They not only created businesses, but they created the cities. Out of the wealth they created, they built the city. Then they gave their sons a very good academic education. And they wanted them somehow not to go into the dirty industry as it was in those days, but to go into the professions. And they did. And of course, don't forget at that time we had many administrative posts to fulfill. We still had a large empire, many colonies, and we had many administrators to go out and teach those colonies in Africa and Asia the rule of law. And then the great finance businesses developed in the City of London, always associated with the trade that went the world over. And so they went into the finances in the city and into the professions. And when I was young, it wasn't really quite as good to be in industry or wholesale or retail trade as it was in the professions. Absurd! The wealth of a country depends upon its industry and upon its commerce. You can't have commerce if you haven't got the industry. But that's what happened, and it took us quite a time to get it back. And part of what I had to do was to say we must alter our policies to see if we can once again stimulate that enterprise. We must reduce taxation. We must so arrange it that the capital reliefs enable them to invest in new businesses. We must get venture capital. And I used to wonder, is that spirit of enterprise still there? Has it been overlain by this other thing? Or then, of course, in the post-war period, people moving to socialism, dependency on the state industries. So for your standard of living, you lobbied or demonstrated to the state for more instead of looking to your own effort. However, we changed the system back to free enterprise so to give opportunity. We didn't invent it. We just uncovered it again.
And you fought a bruising battle
with
the trade unions.
Yes, I did. They'd got far too many powers.
Monopoly trade unions, you call them.
Yeah, they were. They had far too many powers, and they were abusing those powers. And I think political life really depends upon getting the right balance of power, the right amount on the side of the employed person so that he has certain fundamental rights to be treated properly, and the right on the part of the employer so that he can't be ruined by a strike. So we got the balance right. We got it right, and we fought the coal miners, and we fought them for a year. So there was a great deal of courage, and we weren't going to be put off. We were going to tackle the fundamental issues. I believed that if people actually saw us tackling them, they'd be pleased. And someone had the guts to tackle them, and they'd take the difficulties provided that we were successful in the end. And indeed, they were marvelous. They returned me. I was returned 3 times as Prime Minister, and I've never been defeated. Never been defeated in a vote of confidence in Parliament. Indeed, I think now that some of the government that followed me take for granted that they have a good majority. They were lucky. I had to fight for it, and had to fight for it the best way, the hard way, through 4 years in opposition. My goodness, the spirit is annealed when you fight through those great battles.
I remember in those days you said that you couldn't understand why Britishers felt guilty about making money. You said that they might misunderstand John Wesley, the great founder of Methodism.
You have
Do you
read
think
my
they did?
speeches, haven't you?
I
yes,
have.
You know, they used to say, and it has occurred again since, there have been people who had undermined people who have been successful and done well, and made quite a lot of money in the process. And why shouldn't they, if you're successful? Why shouldn't you make money? And John Wesley was very good. He had a whole sermon on money. He's very well worth reading, John Wesley's sermon. One of them meant like this: do not impute to money the faults of human nature. There's nothing wrong with making money, provided you do it honestly. Nothing wrong with it. It's what you do with it that counts. Now, John Wesley himself is a very good example. John Wesley was not merely a brilliant preacher, but a brilliant writer. And he wrote many tracts for leaflets, pamphlets, booklets, for teaching the clergy and teaching other people. And they sold very well. And he would get from them in those days, and it was a very considerable sum. His annual income was about £1,700 a year from this. That's a lot of money. Now, he is an extreme example. He gave away everything except £85 a year on which he lived. But you see the point. It's not the money, it's what you do with it. Now, you plough it back into investing and creating jobs. How are you to have jobs if someone hasn't the enterprise to create them, build them up? I'd far rather work for a successful businessman than for one who hadn't any talent and ability to build a successful company. So it's not materialism, it's a natural wish to do better for your family, to be able to help your parents through a sticky time, to see that your children can travel and know the wonders of the world. You shouldn't be ashamed of it, you should be proud of it.
Tell me about Gorbachev. You first met him in 1984. He was 3 months away from being named the Soviet leader. You were very impressed with him. What impressed you right from the start?
He was not Secretary General then. Chernenko was in power after Andropov had died, and we had been looking at our forward strategy, and our strategy with regard to the whole of Eastern Europe, which was to go and visit those East European countries to give them aid and comfort. And then we thought, what about the Soviet Union? And I said, we simply must get to know some of the future generation. They will soon be in power. And so we learned about Mr. Gorbachev. He was one of the future generation, and we got him over. And we were the first non-communist country that he had visited. So, of course, he saw a new world, a world of plenty. Not queues, not shortages, a world of plenty of food, plenty of goods. But what impressed me was he was quite different from any other communist I'd ever met. When Mr. Gorbachev came, he had done a lot of homework. He had a notebook on which he'd written various things himself. We discussed all sorts of things: international affairs, America, Britain, arms control, our two different ways of life. He was very interested in agriculture. He told me that they grew a lot of crops in the Soviet Union. The weakness was not what they grew, but they somehow could not manage to harvest about 30% and get it to the market, because of the inefficiency in the system. And then we began to talk about the market economy, which isn't an economic theory at all. It's the oldest way known to man of exchanging what you have made with the goods that someone else has made in a lively place, the marketplace, not a theory, a lively part of life. But you see, this man could debate, discuss, was interested, knew what was wrong. Why couldn't they get their harvest to the shops? Why did it go rotten? Why hadn't they got the right storage? Why hadn't they got the right equipment? Why in the world, if they put it on trains, could they not get it to the right place? Why did some of the trains disappear and the stuff go off into the black market? He could discuss it openly. He knew what was wrong. He admitted it. Don't you see?
Yes.
Quite remarkable.
Of course, you had a great military triumph in the Falklands War. Thinking back to that and looking at the Persian Gulf conflict, how would you compare the two?
Well, very different in many ways, because we were alone in the Falklands. And we had to send a whole armada, a whole fleet of vessels, 8,000 miles away, with the Argentinian forces on the Falklands just waiting for us to arrive. And therefore they could have reinforced. We did not have air superiority. We sent originally only 19 Harriers, which had to operate from aircraft carriers. They had all their air force just 400 miles away on the coast. We had to send immediately another 19 Harriers. We couldn't have done it without the Harriers, vertical takeoff and down. And they, of course, had heavy air raids on our ships from land, so it was very different on the air superiority. We had to send the soldiers on the ships and keep them on the ships. They weren't able to land. There weren't tanks or very much equipment of that kind. So it was a very, very different kind of battle, and the ships had to go there, and all the soldiers on them, and the equipment and the aircraft, in terribly cold waters, in terrible high winds. So it was a completely different kind of battle, and one wondered, well, now, how are we going to win? And relied on the professionalism of one's soldiers. I learned one thing that was of great use in the Gulf, two things. First, dictators don't withdraw. They daren't. They have to be thrown out. So I had not the slightest shadow of doubt from the beginning we'd have to have a land battle. And secondly, if you've got long supply lines, keep sending the stuff you want to know that it's either there or in the pipeline. Every single thing you may need, because it's no good them squealing for it without giving us time to get there.
Mrs. Thatcher, you've been such an enormous figure in Britain and in the world that people haven't known to whom to compare you, so they've turned to British monarchs. Some compare you to Elizabeth I. What monarch would you choose to be compared to? What about Henry VII?
No, I think we're just, you can't compare. Constitutional monarchy, where all of the loyalty and patriotism goes to the royal family and get the continuity of experience, which is wonderful, and prime ministers who take all the blame and who come and go. No, and the 49th Prime Minister, I don't know that we can compare ourselves with anyone. Each of us does the job according to the needs of the time, and as we see the needs of the time. Because in my case, you just had to have a star to steer by, and mine was to stop Britain from being satisfied with decline and bring it out into a new confidence, a new enterprise, a new success. And we did just that.